Colin, at times in my life, I really wanted to know what ultimate reality is all about. And those episodes keep coming back, I guess like malaria or something. What can we say about the capacity of science to address that issue?
Well, I mean, ultimate reality is a very grand phrase, but I think it deserves a bit of dissection first. I mean, what kind of reality would not be ultimate? I mean, reality, the real question is, can we fully comprehend the nature of the world, of our universe, the way it works, and then, even more intriguingly and challengingly, how organisms work, including ourselves? I suppose that many people would say, well, what matters is the big questions that are very difficult to translate into scientific questions. And they're usually questions that begin with the word why. Now, why are we here? Why is the universe the way it is? Why has humanity been so successful? As if there is a kind of plan. And using the word why makes all kinds of assumptions about the sort of answers that are acceptable. It necessarily answers that imply intention. And that leads you very quickly in a direction that I think science is rather impotent to tackle, and a direction that perhaps is not relevant at all. So a more interesting way of asking the question is whether the scientific method is capable of answering all the questions that it is capable of asking itself. Are there some things that we can ask, like, let's say, how does the human brain work? How does human behavior work? How does memory work? What is a memory? Can we answer those sorts of questions without a single why being involved?
Sure.
And it might be that we can't. I mean, it might be that some questions are just too big, that we don't have the apparatus, there are technical limitations, there are processing limitations, there are computational limitations in how we crunch the data, or even intellectual limits. You just can't get our head around the difficulty. I think it may well be that we come up against those sorts of questions. After all, there is the old conundrum that science depends, of course, on the capacity of the human brain. It's an invention of the brain. It is brains trying to solve problems. Is our brain capable of understanding itself? Can the human brain have the intelligence and the capacity to understand how it works? We're thinking about that as a challenge. These are very different from saying, are there questions which are literally not accessible to the scientific method? The kinds of questions that science is just impotent to
questions
address.
Of morality, questions of aesthetics.
Exactly. Aesthetics I'd take exception to. I think, there is some progress in scientific approach
yes,
to
there
aesthetics.
is. So it's not. I'm saying that's an issue on the table. Whether science can or can't.
The big one, obvious one, is why are we here? Why are we here? That occupies the minds of a lot of people. Why are we here? What's the intention for me in the world? Science is utterly unable to address that question, to answer that question.
Some people would put it a little differently. Some people would say that science can answer that question, that there isn't.
Well, exactly. I know.
That's another way to phrase it. That's science answer. You may think that's not the right answer, but that is science answer.
Well, I think a more intriguing question which science can address is how are people, human beings, constructed in a way that leads to them asking those sorts of questions?
Yes.
What sort of brain do we have that tends to translate questions into questions about intention?
Right. Certainly, that's a legitimate scientific question. And I think we've made progress in getting that answer.
Yeah.
That some of the same reasons why we ask the why question have been part of the development of the brain for other purposes, and that, in a grander sense, has come along with it. I mean, we might have asked, why should we be on the high ground rather than the low ground to protect ourselves from some kind of predators? And that same way of needing to ask a why later on would ask a grander why question.
Yeah, I mean, for most people in their ordinary lives, the real challenges to understanding are other human beings. Sorting out, how does the mind of your best friend or your wife or your lover or whatever, or your school teacher, or your teenage son, how do they work? And how are you going to interact with your pals, your friends, your enemies, in business life or whatever? These are the big intellectual challenges.
Sure.
And the way that we think about other people, of course, is the way that we think of ourselves as active agents in the world, operating, causing, acting, choosing. And that leads inevitably to why questions. Why did he do that? Why did he go there? Why did she say that about him? These are the sorts of questions we ask about each other because they reflect our intentional model of ourselves. When we then project them out onto the physical world and say, why is it here? Why is the universe the way it is? Then what it implies is that there are intentions behind the universe. And I think that's just a false assumption.
That is prejudicing the question with the why as assuming there's an intention behind it. We can give reasons why the brain does that. But let me just stick on the scientific approach to ultimate reality, whatever that is. Some scientists would say, without any disposition towards theology or anything else, that the human brain is not capable of addressing some of these big questions because it didn't evolve for that purpose. It's not big enough. It has to advance. That's a view. Do you agree with that view? I mean, do you think that's possible?
Of course, it's possible. There are limits to what we can do. I mean, it is quite extraordinary that we have a brain which is capable of conceiving the beginning of the universe 7.5 billion years ago. We have a brain which is capable of making instruments that can recreate the beginning of the universe.
We can never know what we can't know. I mean, you can't prove a negative. But if the human brain is able to do science, able to do good science, what is beyond that capability in the physical world? I mean, I can't.
I think you have to start with the assumption that until you have clear evidence that there are those sorts of questions that science can't address, then science can address every question. It may be that we won't be able to solve it. We haven't got the techniques or whatever, or the brain power to analyze. But at least we can address the question. And until we come up against a brick wall of explanation where science simply can't continue, can't frame the questions appropriately to do experiments, then I think we have to have faith in the power of science. It has done a pretty good job. Think of all the kinds of things which are utterly unintelligible. Sure. I mean, just total mysteries, like, how the sun rose, why Venus crossed the face of the sun, how matter works, what gravity is, all these imponderable questions to people just like us a few hundred years ago, where we have cogent explanations nowadays. You have to have faith in science because of what it's already achieved.
And that's my point. So why would you even admit that there's a possibility that there's a terminus to that in terms of whatever there is?
Well, I mean, as a jobbing scientist, you don't. I mean, if you walked into your lab every morning and said, I think there are probably things that science can't really address. Maybe I'm going to hit them today. I mean, what kind of job would that be? But it might be that there are avenues of exploration where we collectively, this species which does science called humanity, says, we've tried everything we can, we can't approach that. So maybe it's beyond the limits of explanation of science. Possibly. There's no example of that yet to my mind.
I can give you an example that you might have to have the power of a cyclotron that would be the size of the galaxy in order to have the power to go to a certain level. Technically, I mean,
rather than a fundamental.
Rather than a fundamental, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Maybe consciousness. I mean, many people have suggested that we just simply, David Chalmers, for instance, that the kind of thing that consciousness is beyond exploration because it is. It's private experience, and science doesn't do well at private things.
He and others would claim that consciousness is another force that's an irreducible one, like the fundamental forces of physics.
In which case, science could have a go at explaining, just as it has with gravity and weak forces and so on.
Sure, and dark energy, and the dark matter, which doesn't interact. There may be other kinds of things, but that's not outside the purview of science. If it is susceptible to repeatable kinds of experiments.
Yes.
I mean, that is a science. So the question is, can science in that sense access ultimate reality? Because if there are things that science can't access, the argument goes, those are not ultimate reality. Those may be points of interest, questions of morality, but then those kinds of questions of morality would be the subjective activities of human beings, and that's. But
they matter to people. How they make decisions,
matter,
the basis of decision making is terribly important.
From a personal point of view, it's terribly important. But from the standpoint of ultimate reality beyond human beings, it's anecdotal or accidental.
Yes, I'm getting a little hung up on this word reality and what it means. And in a sense, reality is the answers to the questions that you pose. If you pose a question and you get a satisfactory answer to it, that becomes part of your reality and your understanding.
Well, I mean, that's an argument. Whether that's sort of an anti-realist approach, as the philosophers would say. A realist approach said there really is an external reality. I may or may not be able to know it, but I'm not constructing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the objective of science should be to try to find accounts of events in the world which are predictable accounts, where one can say in advance what is likely to happen on the basis of the knowledge that you have of the system. And when it comes to explaining, as it were, human beings in those terms, then there is a big challenge, because human beings are just terribly, terribly complicated. But there is no reason to believe that there is something distinctly different about the way in which human beings operate that cannot be addressed by the scientific method. I mean, you have to have confidence in science when you see what it's already achieved. Our brains are capable of knowing and understanding that our universe is 13.5 billion years or more old. We know, or we have the beginnings of an understanding of the building blocks of how the universe was made. We can generate machinery that can replicate the start of our universe and explore it directly. If science is capable of all those things, I think we have to have trust and confidence in its capacity to carry on continuing to explain.